Also weighing in on some other topics affecting your area, Canada. You're in Toronto right now, and Justin Trudeau, he interrupts a woman at a town hall. She's asking him a question, and he didn't like one of the words that she used. Listen to this soundbite, and then we'll get your reaction.
All right.
So that's why we came here today to ask you to also look into the policies that religious charitable organizations have in our legislation so that it can also be changed, because maternal love is the love that's going to change the future of mankind. So we'd like you to look into
we like to say people kind, not necessarily mankind, because it's more inclusive.
There we go, exactly.
And the crowd roars.
Yeah. Well, it's quite the performance. I mean, I'm afraid that our Prime Minister is only capable of running his ideas on a few very narrow ideological tracks. We saw the first evidence of that when he put his cabinet together. He insisted upon making it 50% women, despite the fact that only about 22% of the elected MPs were women. And it was easier for him to do that than it was for him to screen people for the sort of competence that would actually be necessary to be cabinet members. So we've seen a fair bit of this behavior, but that was the most egregious example, I suppose.
Dr. Peterson, I recall you taking some heat because you said you would refuse to use these gender-neutral pronouns. Why was that?
Well, I actually said that I would refuse to use the pronouns that were mandated by law because they were mandated by law. I feel that it's completely inappropriate of the government to decide what language the citizenry should speak. There's never been an example of that in British common law history, and I believe that that was a very, very bad precedent. I didn't want to use language that I thought was generated by radical leftist propagandists, and so I said I wouldn't do it.
I saw one tweet this morning that said Neil Armstrong should have said one small step for people kind.
Yeah, well, you know, Trudeau was listening to an earnest woman try to discuss something important, and he interjected a ideological statement in the middle of the dialogue, and that indicates, I think, precisely the way he thinks. And I don't think he does think. I think he runs an ideology in his head and accepts the output without question. And I think we're really going to pay for it in Canada in ways that we can't yet imagine.
I mean, one of the most appalling things about the budget, as far as I was concerned, is that it provides ample evidence, if such was not sufficiently provided already, that Trudeau is exactly what you would be afraid of if you were afraid of him. He doesn't have an answer to a problem that isn't overwhelmingly predictable ideologically. It's like you don't even need him. You just have to run the ideology. It has the answers. What's the big problem? Equity between men and women. It's like, sorry, that's not the big problem. That's not even, you're not even scratching the surface of the problem with that approach. And your solutions, it's like you can learn those solutions your first week in women's studies. They're not solutions. They're the sorts of solutions that children toy with when they have no idea what they're contending with. Yeah, well, there's not a lot there, I'm afraid. Fixing these complex systems is unbelievably complicated, and you're likely to make them worse when you're mucking about with them haphazardly, right? And so it's way easier just to do this. Trudeau said it back in, wasn't it 2016? Why are half the cabinet women? Because it's 2000 and, was it 16 or 15? Yeah. Well, it's almost impossible to overstate how shallow that comment is, and how not only shallow, but it's also casually malevolent in an unconscious sense, because he had a job to do, which was to evaluate his MPs thoroughly and skeptically and pick the best people, period. But that isn't what he did. He said, oh, well, it's 2016, so I'll appoint half women. It's like, well, everybody gave him a pass on that, and so here we are. Now we have a budget that's equity-focused. Yeah, well, good luck with that. When I look at Trudeau, there's a couple of things that I see. I see someone who hasn't grown up. So he's Peter Pan. I see someone he knows how to behave in public. That's one thing you can say about him. He's got that easy charisma and charm that comes from being good-looking, being from a favored background, the favored background that he's from. He's got by on that. And the reason I believe that is because I don't believe that if he had any true character that he would have run, because he ran on the strength of his name, and he hadn't earned the right to do that. But people elected him, so here we are. And this is what we get. I mean, he pulled out the ideological card when he formulated the cabinet, and Canadians all went, "Oh, isn't that cute?" It's like, no, it's not cute. It's not acceptable. And now we're paying the price for it. Our Prime Minister is a great example of that. So back, I think it was in 2015, he announced that half of his cabinet was going to be women because it was 2015 or some like muddle-headed virtue signaling excuse for not thinking. I think only 20% or 25% of the elected MPs were female. So the proper balance on average would have been 25% female, 75% male. What he should have done was figured out what qualities would make for a competent cabinet minister, because it's actually quite important to have competent cabinet ministers, and then selected from among his people for nothing other than competence. But he could virtue signal, and then he set up the most important board, let's say, of the entire country on a quasi-random basis. Jesus, how pathetic. He should have been pilloried by Canadians for that. But we're so clued out, and also in the situation that you described, is like, if I say, well, 50% of Trudeau's cabinet shouldn't have been women, it's like, oh, you're a misogynist. It's like, no, only 25% of the elected officials were women. Now, you might say, well, it would be better if 50% of them were elected. It's like, maybe it would be better, but it didn't happen. So you can't fix it at the top end. It was appalling. So it's a hard argument to make, because you need to know that there's more difference within groups than between them in order to be able to come up with a credible argument, And then, so, yeah. I mean, I think that his decision to put 50% women in the cabinet was an abdication of responsibility of a magnitude that we haven't seen before in Canadian political history. Only 26% of the MPs elected were female. And that should have been approximately the proportion of cabinet members. But to say this is 2015 or whatever the hell the year was, and then to abdicate his responsibility for selecting the most competent people was an indication of exactly how, how suited he is to be Prime Minister. And people just didn't make much of an issue of that because of their attempts to be tolerant. But I think that what he did was, I thought the fact that he ran to begin with was reprehensible because he ran entirely on the name brand recognition that he had derived from his father.
Yes.
And I think that that's the mark of someone who's narcissistic. Yeah. He shouldn't have done that. Or
it worked, though. A lot of immigrants voted for him. My dad voted for him.
He's very charismatic and attractive, and he knows how to behave in public. Mm-hmm. And he had a very, very famous name. But I believe that it was immoral of him to run because we're not dynasties. Democracies aren't dynasties. And he hadn't the CV, the record of success that you would need as an independent individual to justify himself as a qualified candidate for Prime Minister. So I thought that his candidacy right from the start was ethically flawed. Mm-hmm. But then to multiply that error with these shallow attempts at broadcasting tolerance, especially at the expense of competence and the capacity to truly evaluate, is just inexcusable. Look, it's unbelievably widespread. So I'll give you an example that's very similar. Our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, announced in 2015 that half the cabinet that he put together would be women, despite the fact that only approximately, I think it was 20 to 25% of the elected officials were female. And so what he basically admitted, as far as I'm concerned, was two things. Number one, he was incapable of judging people on their competence. Because when you put together something like the cabinet for a country, what you do is you find the most competent people, period. Because it's so bizarre that it even has to be said, because it actually turns out that the cabinet is important. And so, to me, all he did was default on his central moral obligation to screen every single one of his members of parliament with exceeding care and to pick the most qualified people. And his rationale was that it was 2015. And to reduce competence to racial, ethnic, gender identity, something like that, is an absolutely appalling move philosophically as well, as far as I'm concerned, to assume that diversity is somehow represented by group membership. There's no evidence for that. There's absolutely no scientific evidence for that whatsoever. In fact, the scientific evidence suggests quite the contrary, which is that there's more variability within groups than there is between groups, which is actually an antidote to the central racist claim, right? Because the central racist claim is there's more difference between groups than there is difference within them. And so, you've seen one black person, you've seen them all.